Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's segment of Scheller Lunchtime Live. I'm Trent Thurman, Associate Dean for Executive Education at the Scheller College of Business, and on behalf of the faculty and staff of the college, I want to welcome you to today's event. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Beryl Tokte, a professor of operations management, who will introduce today's distinguished speakers. Dr. Tokte is the Brady Family Chairholder here at the Scheller College of Business. Her primary research areas are sustainable operations and supply chain management, and she's also the founding faculty director of the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business. Beryl?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trent. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Trent said, I'm the faculty director of the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Ariana Robinson, Assistant Director of Business Operations for the center, and of course, our guest today, Dr. Tiffany Johnson. So thank you so much, Tiffany, for being here with us. If you've joined because you're interested in talking about the intersection of work, equity, and wellness. So welcome, and we look forward to a great conversation today. Before we jump in, though, let me say a few words of introduction about the center and about our guest today. So at the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business, what we hope to do is to inspire and empower the next generation of leaders to create a sustainable future. And when we talk about sustainable future, we're not only talking about recognizing the environmental constraints that we face and addressing challenges like climate change and material waste and so on, but we're also talking about having a thriving social foundation, equity, access to energy, access to food, access to education, all of those things that create a strong social fabric. And that's why it was a great pleasure to join forces and combine our business environment and society speaker series with the Scheller Lunchtime Live. And Ariana has been at the forefront of the efforts of our center to bring in the concepts of equity and wellness, not only into the center's operations and activities, but also how we work together as staff. So that's the perspective that she brings today. So let me now jump into Dr. Johnson's introduction. So she's an assistant professor of organizational behavior here in the Scheller College of Business. She came to us after earning her PhD in management and organization at Penn State. And before that, she got a master's degree in human resources and industrial relations from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And in her research, Dr. Johnson focuses on the micro foundations of inequity. And what she's particularly interested in is how individuals within organizations not only create, but also dismantle experiences related to stigma and marginalization. And she's looking at that in the context of race, gender, social class, and other differences, such as autism. That's one of her published works, because that context is so important to recognize in today's workplaces and organizations. And we're really lucky to have Dr. Johnson in Scheller. She's an award-winning scholar. Her dissertation was selected as a finalist, and she's published her work in the most recognized journals in our field. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Tiffany.
Amazing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. We're going to have like a conversation today about work equity and wellness and about this class that I taught for the first time in summer of 2021. But before we jump into our conversation, what I would like to do is kind of ground us in a little bit of background about myself and about the class, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So first, I would be remiss if I did not thank Scheller Lunchtime Live and the Sustainability Center for inviting me to have this conversation today and to talk about and to just reflect on my experience, my learning, my research thus far. So Beryl talked about this, but I just want to add a little bit more information. I was born and raised in northern Illinois, a small town by the name of Freeport, Illinois, if anybody's ever heard of it. It's a small town, about 30,000 people. And we had a thing about like mascots. So in the town that I grew up in, our junior high mascot was a shamrock, and our high school mascot were and still are the pretzels, right? So you had to have a pretty strong sense of confidence to walk through screaming out go pretzels throughout my high school experience. And we had a lot of pretzel pride, and I still do. That kind of gives you some context about where I grew up. Our field trips were to farms. We milked cows for our field trips, right? Like those were some of the things that I experienced growing up. In addition to that, I like to always mention that I come from a family of community-oriented, socially motivated workers. That's a whole mouthful to say that I come from a family of what we might call good workers, people who are trying to be social innovators, who work in nonprofits, who are always trying to figure out ways and be a part of the change that's more positive in society. And I also grew up deeply entrenched on both sides of my families, both sets of grandparents in the church. And so a lot of my time was in these kind of community building, relationship building kind of spaces. And as much as I like to kind of cling on to my identity as an introvert, where, things like this may be a little nerve-wracking for me to speak to a whole bunch of people, or, I may shy away from social interactions at times, what helps me to anchor into moments like this is to remember that, I come from a family of people and a group of people who really did value relationship, really did value being in community and supporting each other in those kinds of ways, and really did value dialogue to help move society forward, to help advocate for society to move forward. I like to share that because I don't think I would be studying what I study today without the background that I come from. And so my bachelor's degree was in Spanish and international studies at the University of Illinois. I went to school thinking I was going to be a medical doctor, and I ended up 15, 16 years later being a philosophical doctor. I just realized in the very beginning that that wasn't what I was cut out for, what I actually wanted to do. I wanted to be able to contribute to society and to the health and well-being of people in society, but just not in that way. But I always really enjoyed culture and traveling. And I was so curious about the African diaspora. And so in undergrad, I studied Spanish and international studies because I was having these dreams in Spanish, right? And like high school. But I was so curious about what we now know to be the global majority, right? I was so curious about the Black experience all over the world. And so that led me into, not only learning Spanish, but learning Portuguese, studying in places like Costa Rica and Brazil and Panama and Nicaragua, in order to, learn the culture and learn language, of course, but to kind of learn about experiences of Blackness all over the world, or at least in Latin America. And so after my bachelor's degree, if you can't tell, I am a storyteller, which is why we're having a conversation today. I went on to work. I was working full time as a multicultural marketing manager for a major insurance company. And it was in that role that I started to see a lot of the concepts that I was studying around culture and diversity kind of like come into the context of work. And I had questions, right? I had questions around why I was experiencing relationships in certain ways in the workplace. And so those questions drove me back to get a master's and to pursue a master's degree in HR, IR. And it was in that master's degree that I took a class on diversity with Professor Dr. Aparna Joshi. And she was the person that inspired me to continue to ask questions, to not become okay with the answers that exist today, but to instead continue to pursue questions, to continue to ask questions in ways that bring in sociology, psychology, anthropology. I just loved the way she talked about diversity and inclusion. And so with that, I decided, and I was grateful and honored to be included in the number of PhD students to graduate from Penn State University and from the business school. And the rest, as we know it, is history, right? So my research, Beryl mentioned it, is looking at the micro foundations of inequity in organizations, and what that basically means. The fancy way of saying, like, what are the ways in which we relate to each other? So going all the way back to kind of like my roots, what are the ways in which we relate to each other that seem so small, but can actually either create a more equitable and inclusive place, or that can actually make it harder to have that kind of experience. And so,
can I jump in and ask you something, Tiffany?
Sure.
Maybe other people are thinking about this too. Often when people go in and start pulling from sociology, anthropology, etc., they might go and do a PhD in one of those fields. Yet you chose to do it in the business school in organizational behavior.
Yeah.
Was there a fork in the road that took you in that direction? And why business? And how what is that experience like doing the kind of work that you're doing in a business school?
Yeah, so I actually enjoy it quite a bit, but my thought process several years ago around this was I was interested in, the sociology and psychology, all these things were kind of the subtext for my major interest in workplaces, right? I was thinking about the workplace that my mama and my daddy worked at, and I wanted their workplaces to have a certain kind of experience, to be involved in it, to have certain kind of human resources, to really think about human resources in competitive ways, to think about diversity and equity and inclusion in ways that were actually going to help them to not only be effective in their communities, but also be effective for their other stakeholders, because they were all, they were being driven by grants. And I saw it all as business. I'm like, that's business to me. And to be very transparent, I started out with my PhD program in the HRIR program. And then I moved schools to the business school program. And so I think it was a great serendipitous opportunity for me. It was actually where I needed to be at that time. And I think it gives me a little bit of an interesting kind of background, because I have this HR, so like a beginning of a PhD in HRIR that ended in a PhD in business. So it does make my experience teaching and researching, I think, perhaps it may be experienced as a little bit different. That involves a lot of other topics. It's very inter and multidisciplinary, or at least I try for it to be. Yeah.
Well, glad that you took that fork.
I'm very grateful. Yeah, me too. So I'm just gonna give us some grounding for this class that I taught for the first time in the summer of 2021, but started kind of cooking up around 2018, 2019. And it's not just a class, it was really also rooted in my research, which we'll get to in a little bit. But what it is, you heard work, equity, wellness, work, racial equity, and wellness. It's basically a body of work that's inviting us all into learning about and reflecting on the historical and present day intersections of work, racial equity, and wellness. An assumption of the course that's really important is that society and workplaces are interdependent. This is actually something I put in on my teaching statements and in all my syllabi, right? That society and workplaces are interdependent, and that furthermore, the course is based on the premise that people that are employed in an organization represent important resources through which not only the workplace Culture is created, but also societal norms can be reimagined and recreated. That's a really wordy way of saying that it's rooted in this belief that workplaces are not benign. They are not benign spaces, and that they are either participating and particularly helping to recreate harmful and violent practices or dismantle harmful and violent practices. The same practices that we see happening in our backyard or on the streets or on the news, they are also perpetuated or dismantled in workplaces. Like that's the way that that the class is grounded, that the research is grounded, and I'm not the only researcher that does work around these kinds of groundings. But I like to say that before we get started in the class, so that we can invite that interdisciplinary kind of lens to workplaces and begin to not see them as benign spaces. It's very influential spaces, actually. Um, and so something that I like to do for myself and for everyone in the class or in the space is to introduce people, human beings who have been anchors for myself, and quotes that they offer to help us center ourselves on what we're gonna and how we're gonna approach work equity and wellness, right? Um, And so these are kind of people who I consider to be teachers. We have a lot of people who we think of as teachers in organizational behavior. And I think they've all been helpful and grateful. And everything I do rests on what they have already taught. And I like to think of some additional people that we may not often think about as teachers into the conversation, including people like Bell Hooks, whose conversation around a love ethic is has been extremely influential in my own life. And so, something that Bell Hooks says is that individuals who choose to love can and do alter our lives in ways that honor the primacy of a love ethic. We do this by choosing to work with individuals we admire and respect, by committing to give our all to relationships, by embracing a global vision wherein we see our lives and our fate as intimately connected to those of everyone else on the planet. And I really appreciate Bell Hooks' kind of work around a love ethic because many people will think about love, compassion as these really soft topics, but what we'll talk about with this class is that they're actually really fierce topics. They're actually some of the hardest things to actually put into practice in this society and for all of us. And so one of the other things that she says that I really appreciate and that really inspires me is that loving practice is not aimed at simply giving an individual greater life satisfaction. It is extolled as a primary way we end domination and oppression. So what this means to me and what this makes me curious about and what I invited into the classroom in terms of how can we be curious about this work that we're getting ready to do together is, what does it mean if love is not just this way of going about people pleasing, doing what other people want us to do, saying what other people want us to say, but what if it's actually a confrontational practice? What if a love ethic is actually one of the most uncomfortable things that we can do to shake up the way that we are engaging and working in this particular era? What if love is the primary way that we end domination and oppression, right? Not the life satisfaction, right? I'm not sacrificing, I'm not uncomfortable, but the uncomfortable aspects of it. That I don't have the answers still. I don't know if I ever will, but it's something that I like to just drop as a seed to get us to be curious. And Audre Lorde offers this quote, but when we begin to live from within outward, then we begin to be responsible for ourselves, to ourselves in the deepest sense. One thing that I really enjoy asking myself, right, in this process and inviting anyone else into, if they're interested, right, is this question about what does it mean to do this work in such a way that I'm being responsible to myself and for myself in a very deep sense. Is this one of the ways in which I can engage in a love ethic that also helps to build and to help to reimagine and recreate a different way of being. Again, these are all questions that have to be researched, right? Or that are being researched, I'm sure. But these are just questions that I ask my students and ask myself, that I just want us to engage in a little bit. And of course, we must be the change that we want to see in the world. By Mahatma Gandhi. All of this to say, what we kind of anchor ourselves in this class is this idea of we heal society by healing ourselves. We transform society by transforming self. If we don't go through the process of trying to be these people that are making a better world without thinking about our own personal life and what we are doing, right? And so that's kind of, and again, I say that from like a very much so like, it's a practice that I'm trying to do. And I don't think anybody's going to do it perfectly, but it's really an invitation to think about work equity and wellness in this way. And so I'll stop there so we can have more conversation. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to chatting now. So yeah.
That's great, Tiffany. No, thank you for that overview. I was like, just I couldn't wait to get to the conversation part for sure. So when we talk about working on ourselves, I think it's such an important part of the process, right? So how does that play out in a classroom? What does that look like in terms of developing the skill to really be able to look internally, do some sort of self-reflecting that we can then take out into the world?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. What I didn't mention is that I'm also a yoga and meditation teacher. And when I moved to Atlanta, I became a student of stillness-based practices. So what ended up happening when I moved to Atlanta, I've been doing this work on stigmatization for invisible stigmatized identities and visible stigmatized identities. I did, as Beryl mentioned, I've done a good amount of research, I won't say a lot, a good amount of research on workers with autism and related disabilities. And I've done work on people with, on like sexual orientation, on social class, and then also race and social class intersecting. And a lot of the questions and the themes that came up in my research and my existing research and my research that's under review right now is this like idea of mindfulness, of compassion, of how do I like reflect. A lot of times I heard people talking about their own processes. Like, how do I do the work out here? There's a certain process I'm engaging internally. And so all that to say, I was really curious about what that looked like. But then when I came to Atlanta and became a student of stillness-based practices under the guidance of Octavia Rahim and Meryl Arnett, what ended up happening was I started to see a shift in the way that I worked and even in the way that I saw these topics. I don't know if this has ever happened to you all, where you hear about something and you're like, okay, that sounds great. But then when you start to actually experience it, it just feels like a different kind of breakthrough. You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of what happened. And so the class tries to create an environment that allows for people to be vulnerable, to process, and to rest, right? And to like reflect.
There's a comment in the chat actually that I want to highlight. Perhaps you'd like to respond to that. One of the participants is saying, I found in my study that self-reflection is a huge part of knowing yourself, your purpose, and leadership resilience work, but it can be difficult if you're not ready for the work and the potential challenging and difficult situations that you may encounter. And I wonder if that's something that, well, first of all, what are your thoughts about that? But is that something that you built into your class? Perhaps you could also take this as a pivot to talk about the specific objectives of your class too.
100%.
Oh yeah, they pushed it through so you can see also.
I love that.
The
Thank
comment.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Strickland. Thank you for your comment. And I think I think that your study is reflecting a lot of the things that that I've seen happen in the class and in other, environments in which I'm kind of talking about or experiencing for myself, is that some of this work can be confrontational, right? And so, yes, it comes up in the class. It came up in the class, and part of it for me was to make sure I was doing my work so that I could hold space for the container of different levels of comfortability, right? And to really welcome it, to say, you know what, if you don't believe in what we're talking about right now, that is okay, right? We are not here to try to like move you past whatever part you're getting. If you want to stick right where you are, and that's where you can do right now, that's fine. And I also will say that at the beginning of the class, even when I was introducing the class, I talked to a lot of, when I shared about it in the informational session, excuse me, I shared that it was not a class where you could come and necessarily you would come and feel comfortable, right? Like it was like you might feel a little uncomfortable, and so just so you know, because I'm gonna feel uncomfortable, so you might feel uncomfortable. And what we actually need to do, right, as part of this like way of shifting how we maybe, right, we're just experimenting. Perhaps one of the ways in which we can begin to create more equitable workplaces, more wellness-based workplaces, especially for people of color, is to allow ourselves to relate to our discomfort instead of always pushing it away or choosing environments where we don't feel uncomfortable, right? That is the invitation. And so I think that the students kind of self-selected based off of that invitation. So for the most part, but that doesn't mean that discomfort didn't come up, but we were all willing to say like, I'm feeling a little bit of discomfort right now. And so that does kind of move us into some of the key objectives of the class, like Beryl was kind of alluding to. And so one of them is to not only adopt a framework for analyzing and experimenting with workplace cultures, but the second one was to provide all of us with opportunities to apply the framework and our concepts to our classroom experience. So we talked about how they have actually applied to our classroom experience. Our classroom experience became an organization that we could actually like be in and study at the same time, and to real world organizations that we all cared about. And so what we did was we would talk about the concepts like we're doing now, but over time, what the time gives us in a semester, even in a summer semester, right, is it gives us time to start practicing the things that we're talking about, to move the concepts from up here to like, what does it actually mean to be uncomfortable and to sit in my discomfort? What does it actually mean to be, to assess an organization that perhaps I've had really strong positive emotions about, but to do it through this lens and to see that, oh, there is still room for improvement, perhaps. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean for me to make a mistake, right? To say something wrong and to be lovingly corrected and try again, right? It became a space where over time, right? It was not something that we could rush into on day one. It could not happen after 2 weeks, right? It took us time to get to that space, and we allow for that time to come. And so the class objective is like also around creating more of an experience, right? It's about learning and reading, but it's also about giving us a space, giving us a container to practice some of these things out with each other. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's fantastic. Talk about, we touched a little bit about the disparities at work and wellness, and that we know that there's deeper disparity. We talk about bringing our whole selves to our workplaces and the ability to do that. And so when I think about, embracing mindfulness and wellness, I think there's also just additional hurdles for people of color, right? And so, just if you could talk about that additional piece, you find when people are in survival mode, being able to embrace the mindfulness and wellness, like you're kind of in a different mindset, in a mental space. How does that play out in the workplace? And grounding into this.
So you're asking, how do we play out like being like practicing stillness, or what
Yeah,
does
so
that
I'm
look like?
assuming that the folks in the class are getting the skills to be able to support folks generally, but then there is even a deeper disparity for people of color specifically. And so how does that piece play in?
So in the class, because we are talking about racial equity, like because we center that, and I wanted to do that on purpose. Like that was extremely purposeful for me. Because like I said, I've studied different kinds of identities. And I felt like in 2018, 2019, the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion was one in which we could not, it was hard to talk about it. Like, how can I talk about it if I'm not talking about race? Even the people that I talk to about other kinds of identities around disability and around gender and around sexual orientation, the people they bring up in terms of who are their models for the work that they're doing are people who are engaging in racial justice activities, right? And so it was always a reminder to me that, yeah, especially in the context of this particular country, we cannot talk about these concepts without anchoring ourselves into like, what is our country's history around this? Like, what is the historical context for this? And the more that I read about our historical context, it was so clear to me how racial equity was intertwined, or inequity was intertwined with wellness, right? With uh, a lack of ability to, or a lack of expectation to be well, to have ownership over one's own body, especially if you're in a Black, brown, or yellow body, right? To be able to really, and that also intersects with work. If we think about equity in this particular country, we cannot talk about it without talking about the historical legacy of plantation slavery. We cannot talk about it without talking about that, because that has so many deep roots that also are, that touch upon well-being and expectations around who does what kind of work, and expectations around what work looks like in a Black body versus a white body versus a brown body, right? And then how people are treated when they do or don't assume those roles, when they don't subjugate to those kinds of roles. And while that may seem like it was so long ago, not really. And if it were so long ago, if we look at whenever we start to look at what's happening in business as usual kinds of organizations, you can still see traces of it. And I'm really grateful for Nicole Hannah-Jones' work, the 1619 Project, because she definitely begins to demonstrate, like show us this, right? And so to your question, this is like a really long way to answer your question. I apologize. We use a historical perspective to begin talking about the disparities, like the historical disparities, so that people of color, and so that Black folks, people of color, do not feel an extra layer of shame because of the maybe additional challenges of resting, or of being still, or of engaging with mindfulness. Like, these are things that we will all struggle with across ethnic backgrounds. Like, right, so Dr. Stephanie Creary, who was a guest speaker in the class for this summer, her and Karen and Dr. Karen Locke, they just have a most recent paper in Earth Science about overwork, right? And how overwork is so common. And and it affects everybody. It's just there are special effects on Black bodies and bodies of color. And that becomes more clear when we look at the history of the country, like why that happens.
So one of the things here is workplace culture that you're bringing up, and we've all heard the term toxic workplace culture. And I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they're thinking about, say, a manager who's being very difficult, or a particular person harassing someone in any one of different ways. But when you talked about workplaces not being benign, I'm just reminded that for a workplace to feel toxic for someone, you don't have to have that kind of just one person creating challenges. It can be embedded in the whole culture of the organization in ways that to some people feel, and you've also heard this term, colorblind. A lot of people will say, oh, I'm totally colorblind, or our organization's HR practices are totally colorblind. And that's not, by definition, that's not true because of the historical context that you're talking about. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on this notion of workplaces not being benign. What are very like standard ways, that's not the word I'm looking for, but kind of pedestrian ways, almost unnoticeable ways in which workplaces are actually not benign for minorities or people, like you said, in black, brown, yellow bodies?
I would go back to this idea of overwork, right? It's not racially benign. Yeah. If we think about overwork, like, oh, and burnout and being in like grind culture, being like super, super busy, always having busy schedules, competing over who has the busiest schedule, right? Stacking our calendars.
There is that macho culture, like also in a university.
Yes,
People are proud of how busy their calendars are. And
yes, we have to name like white body supremacy and hyper masculinity and as things that have driven overwork. And I really am grateful for Trisha Hershey of the Enact ministry, who does a lot of teaching and working and writing about this topic and educating the masses on this topic, right? Is that like people are tired and this exhaustion is not racially benign. And that's something that we can begin to like think about. And so what are some of the subtle ways in organizations that we expect, right? Even like the seemingly like nobody here is trying to be a horrible person, right? Like, so we can just take that out. So even when we are trying to be like, I want to include you, or I want to invite you to this, or I want you to help out with this, in what ways are we still, and I think about this all the time, and I thought about it a lot in this class and with students and with my colleagues and all over. But like, in what ways am I subtly expecting more from a Black woman or a Black man or a Latinx person or an Indigenous person? In what ways am I expecting way more for less, or for not, and without like a certain level of compensation, right? In what ways am I demanding that may actually reflect some of these kind of things? Because if we don't realize how the like compounding effects of racism, sexism on certain groups of people, we won't realize that you're probably not the only person asking them for something, right? Because everybody has that subtle understanding of like, well, I'm just gonna ask like because they can do it all, right? And so I have a dear friend and scholar sister, Dr. Natalie Watson Singleton, who does amazing work on strong Black womanhood, and this is what that research suggests, right? It's this idea, this belief that Black women are supposed to do it all and not feel any pain. And we see some of this being reflected in like maternity issues for Black women as well, right? But it happens in the workplace too. And so to your question, I think that overwork is extremely important for us all to think about. And it is also not racially benign.
Thank you for that. I see Ariana nodding. I wonder if you want to add perspective, especially on this strong Black womanhood, because I know we've discussed it, the two of us.
Yeah, no, so I would love to hear, so in terms of, how we teach this, this is the fascinating part about this. I think it's so important, and then it's just exciting to have this in a classroom setting. So I would just love to hear, in terms of, you've got your course objectives, how does this learning play out in the classroom?
And if I can piggyback on that question, I think partly, which is where Ariana is going, I think people who are tuned in are also thinking about how they can be a force for change, how they can be part of the dismantling process in their organizations. And I'm assuming that there's a lot of that discussion also happening in your class.
Yes.
So diving into that a little bit would be very interesting too, I think, for our audience.
For sure. I'm happy to. So first I'll speak to kind of the ways in which I do this, or I try to invite it in the class, and then I'll switch over to some of the ways and like how, for folks who have questions around how to do this or enact positive change to some of these topics that we've been talking about. I will say that, especially after reflecting from this first semester, that the class, the learning, and I know I've said this a couple of times, it was through like readings and different media content and, all of that. But I really feel like there was something that happened that only happens in that immersive experience. There was a certain relational component to the class that not only did I see and witness, in students softening and opening up to each other and really starting to explore things and becoming more aware of things and just questioning more things and being open to imagine things in different ways. But I noticed myself also shifting and transforming in ways that I didn't know. And I don't think can happen unless you're in an intentional community that's trying to relate around these things over time. It was truly an immersive experience that I was not even aware. I did not even know would end up feeling this way until we got to like the last 2 or 3 weeks of class, right? And there was a deep kind of connection that I felt with the students who were, not everybody's going to talk a lot or participate a lot, but with the folks who really were showing up for the class, there was a stronger connection that I feel actually allowed us to practice and be open to practicing some of these concepts and being willing to make mistakes in front of each other in the class and in those relationships. And I think that was the way that we did it. It wasn't, it was, and I think my background, my researching and my background with my teachers here in Atlanta and my cohort of yoga teacher trainees here in Atlanta, and all of these folks have helped me to understand about holding the space in a certain kind of way so that we could, try to do this together. But I can't say that it was anything really else besides being in the connected experience together and being in relationship, actually building relationship with each other. It's probably the deepest part. And so to the question of how we can enact positive change is actually related to that. I think that something that we talked about a lot in the class this semester was letting go of quick fix mentalities. Realizing that it took how long for us to get to this place. I don't know how long it's going to take for us to do something different, 100%. But also we realizing small wins, small shifts and changes, especially shifts and changes that happen internally. Right. And that's where some of the rest practices I believe helped us to do that, because I think they help us to pause a little bit and not to be so reactionary, and instead to be a little bit more proactive, or to think a little bit more. And of course, this is not a thing about perfection, but it's also just an invitation to say, like, do I have the patience to see this process through, or to be a part of the process? I may not even see the fruits of the whole process, but am I willing to be a part of something that's slower moving? Right? This is not and I know many people say this, but I think the class we really did have to embrace that. Like, we are not doing this overnight. Even when the class ends, we are not done. And so letting go of a quick fix mentality, interrogating what is business as usual, not just in your workplace, but in your own personal approach to work. What is normal for you? What do you deem to be like the normal way of going about work? And I would just ask, or I would just invite that some like interrogation around that. So in class, one of the things that we talked about was like interrogating, what does it mean to be quote unquote professional? Perhaps another seemingly benign word that has so many racial undertones, right? And so beginning to really interrogate, going back to like doing the inner stuff, like bringing the concepts back to our personal lives, and then beginning to shift based off of that. I would say also, I and this class, and even in the space, I'm trying to let go of like this expert mentality. Not to say that, I'm not saying that to minimize my own work and my own efforts and my own research, because I know I've put in a lot of effort and I've done a lot of work around these topics. But, and also, I also feel that that can also limit my ability to understand what needs to be recreated and reimagined, and it can limit my creativity. And so I think that, and it can limit my ability and my willingness to experiment, right? If I think I know it all, then I may not be willing to try something new. And I may not be willing to be uncomfortable. And I may not be willing to say, I really messed up, I'm sorry. And so I think that we have to really kind of soften the edges around that too. And lastly, I think to enact positive change, I really think it's important. This class modeled this as well, tried to model this as well, of bringing in other people who know more about stuff than we do. So who have more experience with some things. And so I invited guest professors in, Dr. Stephanie Creary, Dr. Noreen Hassan, who's a professor at Georgia Tech, to talk about the body, to talk about medicine, to talk about our history of medicine in the workplace, right? To talk about overwork, and to really value this idea of collectivity, and really value the people who are doing this work, like doing classes like this, or people who are doing this kind of research in such a way that like they're not just doing it on a symbolic level, but they are really trying, like they are devoted to doing this work, right? And I think that their work needs to be valued, and it needs to be valued not only by giving them recognition, but by allowing them to have a seat at the table, by allowing them to be compensated equitably, and by citing their work, yeah, by giving them credit for what they've done already. And so those are some of the ways that I think that we can enact positive change.
Thank you so much. So before I continue, let me invite those in the audience. If you have, you've shared some comments, some resources, but if you have questions specifically for our speaker, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. One of the things that I want to pull from what you just said is this expert mentality. I think, at the university, whose motto is Georgia Tech, problem solved, I think we feel that there's a lot of onus on us to be the problem solvers. And I think in a workplace culture that emphasizes performance, now, if it is your job as a manager to ensure that we are integrating equity and wellness, then it's again this feeling of, oh, now I should be performing in this, and I should, as the manager, be knowing what to do. I think what I'm hearing from you is, well, you don't have to feel like you have to be the expert. Perhaps a good place to begin is to create a space for listening and for the ideas to come from the organization, from the people, from the diversity of experiences and views, and then find ways of channeling that to start enacting change.
Certainly, that is definitely a way to learn, right? Is to invite people to like listen to. I would also charge folks to, like, if you have questions, to educate yourself. Yeah, like to read up on stuff, to take it upon yourself. Like, I don't know about this. What can I read? Like, where can I go? Google stuff, like invest in being educated by people, right? Again, like being educated by people who you are willing to compensate, especially if they are in marginalized bodies, right? I think it's just really important to like not continue to recreate the overwork for folks so that they can educate us about stuff that, really is, again, being responsible to ourselves and for ourselves. And so one of the things that we said in the class is, if I don't know the answer to a question, I'm going to Google it first. And then I'm going to ask the question, right? So just to begin to become responsible for ourselves and just practicing it, right? But certainly the idea is to not believe that we have to be the expert. It is to take responsibility for the questions that we realize we don't have the answer to. As soon as you realize you don't know something, you know something.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? As soon as you realize it. And so it's like, oh, you are becoming more aware. Now, where will you go to get the answer to that question?
And actually, one of the things that we've done that Ariana has spearheaded is a book club. And it is open to, I think, right, Ariana? It is open to alumni. So if anyone here is interested to join, I think we're still on our second book and there'll be more. I don't know if you want to mention which book we've read and we're reading, but just a resource that we have here.
Yeah, the first book we read was Cast: The Origins of Our Discontents. I mean, it was a very deep place to start. And I think, in general, book clubs are generally described as being performative, right? But I think, to your point, Tiffany, about being willing to get uncomfortable, the conversations that come out of, these book club, these conversations that come out of these readings are, really the type of, learning that changes you. And your perspective. And so I think very similar, and it causes you to question, wow, how am I participating or perpetuating, and or am I actually the ally that I think that I am or would like to think of myself as? And so I think it's been incredibly powerful, even for me as leading it. I've said, and without an ongoing practice, I wouldn't have the courage to be that vulnerable, because these texts are, have a tendency for me personally to be traumatized.
Of course. And I think that's totally, we talked about this a little bit in the class as well, right? It's like sometimes you may not want to be a part of a conversation because you don't want to re-traumatize. And that is a choice that you can make, right? Like, I don't have to be in that space in order for other people to get the learning that they need. Sometimes the best thing I can do to take care of myself is to say, I'm not gonna, that's not for me right now. And that's for people who are in bodies and bodies of color, right? Who know, like, that might be a little much for me. I already know that. I have a visceral experience. Trauma is visceral. right? So perhaps I will sit out, perhaps I will join because I want to also be able to help educate, right? Either one works, but it's really just being able to be mindful of like, these are options that we actually have, right? Yeah. And that the practices can help us to tone our nervous system so that we can, like you are doing, be courageous and help guide the book club. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks for
so
that.
we're currently reading The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGee. Plug. So if you, it's not too late to join us. We're almost about next week we'll be about halfway through the book, so you've got time to catch up.
Yeah, and great guest speakers at the end as well. That's what Ariana is planning. There's one more resource I want to lift up for those of you who are in the business community and wondering how to promote just business practices. There's a Partnership for Southern Equity that has created a just business roundtable. And right now they're in the phase where they're soliciting applications. I think they're not necessarily accepting every applicant because they want to see that there is some investment in that business to just practices already. But I think that's another fantastic resource and network as well. That's Partnership for Southern Equity. Okay, well, we have so many questions that we could be asking and digging in. I just have one last one. At the end of the course, students reflect, sometimes personally, sometimes in the comments. I'm curious if we could maybe end this with some of the student reflections that have been interesting to hear for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to share about that. So towards the end of the semester, kind of, but to Beryl's point, we kind of go from inward stuff to outer stuff, and we start to like look at other kinds of organizations that are kind of resources for us to kind of continue doing this work because we're just starting, right? And so one of the organizations that I talk to students about is Race Forward. They have lots of definitions that might be helpful in practices. But we talk about all kinds of practices, and one of the things that happens at the end is that I realized that students were we were watching each other, right? And I think that it was really important for me. What I noticed, what students noticed was that like I was actually trying. Like I was trying to practice it, and I was failing. I failed a couple times. Like I didn't do what I probably should have done a couple times, but I was trying to practice it. And there was a student who, admittedly said, like, I was one of the students who did not necessarily think that this is a class that I would like, that I would enjoy. But what happened was throughout the summer, I noticed you trying to practice what you were talking about and creating a certain kind of environment, helping to create a certain kind of environment. And that is what helped me to learn. Like that, and they said, I will forever be changed. And that was one of the most touching things because I did not know that I was being watched at that level as well, right? Like I was trying to, I'm here, I'm trying to do my best, but it made me feel like super, super humbled by the kind of connection that we were able to co-create in that classroom and by the opportunity to just practice. And it made me understand that students' reflections, how grateful they were to also be able to just practice it together.
One of the Georgia Tech strategic plan themes is lead by example.
Yes.
The new strategic plan. So thank you for leading by example, for creating that class environment where people can practice and learn in a safe space, but yet knowing that they can lean into their discomfort as they learn. So thank you. And thanks for Ariana, being part of this conversation, bringing your perspective. I think Trent is going to come back on to wrap this up. Thank you, Trent, for hosting.
My pleasure, and thank you, Beryl and Ariana, and a big thank you to Dr. Tiffany Johnson for such an inspiring and impactful and thought-provoking talk. We really appreciate it. If you would like to listen to this again or share it with friends, this will be posted to the college's YouTube channel, so look for that to be posted soon. But thanks for spending your lunchtime with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.